Sarah Mitchell adjusted her reading glasses as she settled into seat 12C aboard the commercial airliner. The afternoon sun streamed through the small window, casting long shadows across the pages of her aviation magazine. To the other passengers, she appeared to be just another traveler heading home from a business conference. They saw a woman in her early 40s, dressed professionally, quietly reading about aircraft specifications and flight patterns. What they couldn't see was the weight of history she carried in her calm demeanor and steady hands. The flight attendant moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts and securing overhead compartments. Sarah glanced up momentarily, her trained eyes automatically assessing the cabin crew's efficiency and noting the aircraft's subtle movements. 23 years of military aviation had ingrained these habits so deeply that she couldn't turn them off, even during civilian travel. The Boeing 737 felt almost quaint compared to the supersonic fighters she had piloted through some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Emma, now a junior at Stanford studying aerospace engineering. "Safe travels, Mom. Can't wait to hear about the conference tonight." Sarah smiled, remembering when Emma was 8 years old, watching in wide-eyed amazement as her mother climbed into the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor. Back then, Emma had declared she wanted to fly jets just like her mom. Now at 20, she had chosen a different path but still shared her mother's passion for aviation. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their cruising altitude of 35,000 feet and an expected arrival time in Denver. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the countless times she had made similar announcements to her squadron, though under vastly different circumstances. Her missions had taken her over hostile territory where every radio transmission could mean the difference between life and death. The routine nature of commercial aviation felt both comforting and strangely foreign. A businessman in the seat beside her glanced at her magazine, noting the technical articles about military aircraft. "You work in aviation?" he asked politely. Sarah nodded with a gentle smile. "I used to fly," she replied simply, not elaborating. She had learned over the years that most people weren't prepared for the full truth of her career. Being one of the first female F-22 pilots in the Air Force wasn't something that came up easily in casual conversation. The turbulence hit without warning, causing several passengers to grip their armrests nervously. Sarah barely flinched, her body automatically adjusting to the aircraft's movements with the practiced ease of someone who had flown through far worse conditions. She noticed the flight attendants moving with slightly more urgency, reassuring anxious travelers while maintaining their professional composure. It reminded her of her early days as a squadron leader, when keeping her team calm under pressure was just as important as executing the mission. Her mind drifted to the medal ceremony 3 months earlier, where she had finally received recognition for a classified mission that had remained secret for over a decade. Standing in her dress uniform, surrounded by fellow officers and her family, she had felt the weight of all those years of service. The missions she couldn't talk about, the nights she had returned to base knowing she might not see her daughter grow up, the constant pressure of proving herself in a male-dominated field. The medal was beautiful, but it couldn't capture the complexity of what it represented. The plane began its descent into Denver, and Sarah gathered her belongings. Her leather briefcase contained the usual business items, reports from the aviation conference, contact cards from potential consulting clients, and her laptop. Hidden in the inner pocket was something far more personal, a photograph of her old squadron, taken just before their deployment to a location she still couldn't name publicly. 8 pilots standing beside their F-22s, their faces young and determined. Only 5 of them had made it home. As the wheels touched down on the runway, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of a successful landing. The passengers around her began reaching for their phones and gathering their carry-on luggage, eager to disembark and continue their journeys. For most of them, this flight was simply transportation from one place to another. For Sarah, every flight was a reminder of how far she had traveled, not just in miles but in life itself. The businessman beside her stood up and extended his hand. "I'm Robert, by the way. Thanks for the pleasant flight." Sarah shook his hand warmly. "Sarah Mitchell. Safe travels." As she said her name, she noticed the flight attendant nearby pause slightly as if the name rang a bell. It was a reaction she had grown accustomed to over the years. though she never knew if people recognized her from news articles, military publications, or simply from the unusual combination of her gender and aviation expertise. Walking through the jetway, Sarah checked her phone for messages. Her former squadron commander had sent her a brief note. "Saw your interview in Aviation Week. Proud of you. Colonel." Even though she had retired with the rank of lieutenant colonel, her old commander still insisted on using her title. It was a sign of respect that meant more to her than any civilian recognition ever could. The Denver airport bustled with activity as Sarah made her way toward the baggage claim. Travelers hurried past her in all directions, each absorbed in their own destinations and purposes. None of them could have guessed that the quiet woman in the Navy business suit had once been responsible for protecting their freedom at altitudes where the sky turns black and the earth curves away beneath you. Her rental car was waiting in the garage, and soon she would be driving through the Colorado mountains to her final destination. Tomorrow morning she had an appointment that would change everything. The call had come 2 weeks earlier from a voice she hadn't heard in years. "Sarah, we need you back." Not for active duty, but for something just as important. The details were still classified, but she knew it involved training the next generation of pilots who would inherit the legacy she and her squadron had built. As she loaded her luggage into the trunk, Sarah took a moment to look up at the evening sky. Somewhere up there, beyond the clouds and commercial flight paths, F-22 pilots were conducting training exercises or possibly real missions. They were younger than she had been when she started, but they carried the same determination and skill that had defined her generation of aviators. Soon she would be helping to shape their futures, passing on not just technical knowledge but the wisdom that could only come from someone who had flown where others feared to go. The mountain road twisted through pine forests as Sarah drove toward Peterson Air Force Base the next morning. The familiar sight of military installations brought back a flood of memories from her 23 years of service. Guard towers, razor wire fencing, and the distinctive silhouettes of aircraft hangars painted against the Colorado sky created a landscape that felt more like home than any civilian neighborhood ever could. At the main gate, the young security airman checked her credentials with the thorough attention that military protocol demanded. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, you're cleared for Building 847, he said, handing back her identification. Sarah noticed the slight emphasis he placed on her rank and wondered if her reputation had preceded her. Word traveled fast in military circles, especially when it concerned one of the few women who had broken through the highest barriers in combat aviation. Building 847 housed the Air Force's most advanced pilot training programs. As Sarah walked through the corridors lined with photographs of legendary aviators, she spotted her own image from 15 years earlier. The photo showed her standing beside an F-22 Raptor, her helmet tucked under her arm and a confident smile on her face. The caption read, "Lieutenant Cole Sarah Mitchell, first female F-22 combat mission commander." Seeing it now felt surreal, like looking at someone else's life. Colonel James Harrison was waiting in the briefing room, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile when he saw her. They had served together during the early days of the F-22 program, when every mission was a test of both the aircraft's capabilities and the pilot's limits. "Sarah, you look exactly the same," he said, embracing her briefly. "Still lying, I see," she replied with a laugh that carried decades of mutual respect and shared experiences. The briefing room walls were covered with charts, mission parameters, and photographs of the current pilot trainees. Harrison gestured toward a particular group photo. "These are our top candidates for the Advanced Combat Program. 12 pilots, including 4 women. They're technically proficient, but they need something more. They need to understand what it means to fly, not just with skill, but with purpose." Sarah studied the faces in the photograph. They were young, confident, and eager, exactly as she had been when she first climbed into a fighter jet. But she could see something in their eyes that concerned her. They had grown up in an era of advanced technology and simulations, where many aspects of flying could be learned in virtual environments. What they lacked was the instinctive understanding of what it meant to push both machine and pilot to the absolute limits of performance. The F-22 program has evolved significantly since your active duty days. Harrison continued, pulling up technical specifications on a large display screen. The aircraft are more advanced, the systems more integrated, but we're finding that our pilots sometimes rely too heavily on technology. They need to learn to trust their instincts and understand that no computer can replace the judgment that comes from real experience. The morning briefing revealed the scope of the challenge. Recent training exercises had shown concerning trends among newer pilots. While they excelled at routine operations, they struggled when faced with unexpected situations that required split-second decision-making. Several incidents had occurred where pilots had hesitated at critical moments, relying on automated systems instead of taking manual control when circumstances demanded immediate action. "This is where you come in," Harrison explained. "We need someone who can teach them not just how to fly the F-22, but how to think like a combat pilot. Someone who understands that technology is a tool, not a crutch. Someone who has been in situations where the only thing standing between success and failure was the pilot's ability to make the right decision in milliseconds." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Training pilots wasn't just about teaching technical skills. It was about preparing them for scenarios where their decisions could affect national security and the lives of their fellow service members. Each pilot she would work with represented years of training and millions of dollars in investment. But more importantly, they were individuals who had chosen to dedicate their lives to protecting others. The tour of the training facilities impressed even Sarah's experienced eye. Simulators had advanced far beyond anything she had used during her active duty. The virtual reality systems could replicate almost any flying condition imaginable, from clear skies to the most challenging weather and combat scenarios. But as impressive as the technology was, Sarah knew that simulation could only go so far in preparing pilots for the psychological pressure of real combat situations. In the pilot ready room, she met Captain Lisa Rodriguez, one of the 4 female pilots in the advanced program. Rodriguez had an impressive record and the kind of focused intensity that reminded Sarah of herself at that age. "Ma'am, it's an honor to meet you," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying both respect and curiosity. "I've read about your missions in the classified briefings. What you accomplished opened doors for all of us." The conversation that followed revealed both the progress and the challenges facing women in military aviation. While barriers had been officially removed, subtle forms of discrimination and doubt still existed. Rodriguez spoke candidly about the extra pressure she felt to prove herself, not just as a pilot, but as a female pilot in a field where any mistake could be attributed to her gender rather than individual performance. "The key," Sarah told her, "is to fly so well that your gender becomes irrelevant. When you're in that cockpit, you're not a female pilot or a male pilot, you're just a pilot. And if you're the best pilot in the air, that's all anyone will remember." The afternoon brought Sarah's first direct interaction with the training aircraft. The F-22 Raptor had been updated with new avionics and weapon systems since her retirement, but the fundamental design remained the same. Sitting in the cockpit felt like returning home after a long absence. Her hands automatically found the controls, and muscle memory guided her through the pre-flight procedures that had been ingrained through thousands of hours of flight time. The lead instructor, Major Kevin Thompson, watched with interest as Sarah familiarized herself with the updated systems. "The basic flight characteristics haven't changed," he noted, "but we've added several new electronic warfare capabilities and enhanced the stealth systems. The pilots love the new features, but sometimes they become too dependent on them." Sarah nodded, understanding the concern. During her combat missions, she had learned that the most advanced technology in the world was useless if the pilot didn't understand its limitations. Technology should enhance pilot capability, not replace pilot judgment, she observed. The moment a pilot stops thinking and starts relying entirely on automated systems is the moment they become vulnerable. As the day concluded, Sarah found herself in the base officers' club, sharing dinner with Harrison and several of the instructors. The conversation naturally turned to war stories and shared experiences, but Sarah was more interested in learning about the current challenges facing pilot training. The world had changed significantly since her active duty days, and new threats required new approaches to combat aviation. The evening ended with Sarah reviewing training records and mission reports in her temporary office. Each file represented a young pilot's journey through one of the most demanding training programs in the world. Some showed exceptional promise, while others revealed areas that needed intensive work. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of helping to shape these pilots into the kind of aviators who could handle any situation with confidence and skill. Outside her office window, The lights of aircraft moved across the night sky like slow-moving stars. Each one represented someone's journey, whether military or civilian, and Sarah felt the familiar pull of the sky that had defined her entire adult life. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would pass on not just technical knowledge, but the wisdom that could only come from someone who had flown where others feared to go. The alarm sounded at 0500 hours, cutting through the quiet of the base guest quarters. Sarah had been awake for 20 minutes already, her internal clock still programmed to military precision despite 3 years of civilian life. She dressed in the flight suit that had been waiting in her closet, the familiar weight and feel of the material bringing back countless memories of missions that began just like this one. The flight line buzzed with pre-dawn activity as ground crews conducted their meticulous inspections of the F-22 Raptors. Sarah watched the young airmen work with the same dedication she remembered from her squadron days. Every bolt checked, every system tested, every detail scrutinized because the lives of pilots depended on their thoroughness. These men and women might not fly the aircraft, but they were just as essential to mission success as any pilot. Captain Rodriguez approached with her helmet bag slung over her shoulder, her expression mixing excitement with nervous energy. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about flying beyond the technology. I'm still not sure I completely understand what you mean." Sarah smiled, remembering her own confusion when her first instructor had tried to explain the difference between being a good pilot and being a great one. "Today you'll start to understand," Sarah replied. "We're going to put you in situations where your instruments might not give you the whole picture, where you'll need to trust what your body tells you about what the aircraft is doing. The F-22 is an incredible machine, but it's still just a machine. You are the intelligence that makes it truly dangerous to our enemies." The briefing room filled with 12 pilots, their faces reflecting the intensity that came with knowing they were about to be tested in ways they had never experienced before. Sarah stood at the front, studying each face and remembering her own early days when every training flight felt like a judgment of her worthiness to wear the uniform. The difference was that she had been one of only a few women attempting to break into fighter aviation, while these pilots were entering a field where female combat pilots, while still uncommon, were no longer unprecedented. "Today we begin advanced combat maneuvering," Sarah announced. "But we're not going to start with the standard curriculum. We're going to start with failure." She clicked to the first slide, which showed an F-22 in a flat spin. "Anyone can fly when everything is working perfectly. The pilot who survives in combat is the one who can fly when everything goes wrong." The first exercise involved flying with deliberately degraded instruments. Sarah had worked with the instructors to create scenarios where pilots would have to rely on physical sensations and basic flight principles rather than their sophisticated displays. It was a lesson she had learned the hard way during a classified mission over hostile territory, when her aircraft's electrical system had been damaged and she had to navigate home using stars and instinct. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, one of the most technically proficient pilots in the group, struggled visibly with the degraded instruments exercise. Sarah watched from the instructor's position in a two-seat trainer, as Morrison became increasingly frustrated with his inability to maintain precise flight parameters without his usual electronic aids. "Stop fighting the airplane," she advised through the intercom. "Feel what it's trying to tell you." "Ma'am, I can't maintain altitude without the displays," Morrison replied, his voice tight with concentration. Sarah could hear the panic beginning to creep in, a dangerous development for any pilot. "Forget the displays," she said calmly. "Look outside. Feel the pressure changes. Listen to the engine. The airplane is talking to you, but you're too busy looking at screens to hear what it's saying." The breakthrough came when Morrison finally stopped staring at his malfunctioning instruments and started flying by instinct. His aircraft smoothed out, his turns became coordinated, and his altitude variations decreased dramatically. "How did you know to do that?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," he replied, wonder creeping into his voice. "It just felt right." "That," Sarah said, "is the beginning of becoming a real fighter pilot." Captain Rodriguez faced a different challenge during her session. Her technical skills were excellent, but Sarah noticed she had a tendency to hesitate at critical decision points, as if waiting for confirmation from her instruments before trusting her judgment. During a simulated combat engagement, this hesitation cost her the advantage in what should have been a straightforward victory. "What were you thinking during that engagement?" Sarah asked during the post-flight debrief. Rodriguez looked embarrassed as she reviewed the flight data. "I had a clear shot. but the computer was showing some conflicting information about the target's position. I wanted to verify the data before firing. Sarah nodded, recognizing the careful, analytical approach that made Rodriguez an excellent pilot, but could prove fatal in combat. In combat, perfect information is a luxury you rarely have, Sarah explained. You have to learn to make decisions based on incomplete data, to trust your training and instincts even when the computers are giving you mixed signals. Hesitation kills fighter pilots faster than enemy missiles. The lesson was harsh but necessary, and Sarah could see in Rodriguez's eyes that the message had been received. The afternoon brought more complex scenarios, including simulated system failures, communication blackouts, and multi-threat environments. Sarah flew with each pilot individually, observing their reactions and decision-making processes under stress. Some adapted quickly to the challenging conditions, while others struggled to overcome their dependence on technology and procedural thinking. During a particularly difficult exercise with Lieutenant Sarah Kim, an equipment malfunction created a real emergency rather than a simulated one. The aircraft's hydraulic system began failing, requiring an immediate return to base and emergency landing procedures. Sarah smoothly took control of the aircraft while coaching Kim through the emergency checklist, turning a potentially dangerous situation into a valuable learning experience. That's what separates simulator training from real flying, Sarah explained to Kim after they had landed safely. In the simulator, you know it's not real, so there's no consequence for failure. But when metal starts bending and systems start failing for real, you discover what kind of pilot you really are. Today you learned that you can handle a real emergency with the same professionalism you show in routine flights. The day's final debrief brought all 12 pilots together to discuss their experiences and lessons learned. Sarah was impressed by their willingness to acknowledge their weaknesses and their determination to improve. These were not pilots who would be satisfied with meeting minimum standards. They wanted to excel at the highest levels of their profession. Today was about unlearning some bad habits and rediscovering your instincts as pilots, Sarah told the group. Tomorrow we'll start building on that foundation with more advanced tactical scenarios. But remember what you learned today about trusting yourself and your airplane. Technology is a tool that enhances your capabilities, but it can never replace your judgment and skill as a pilot. Captain Rodriguez approached Sarah after the other pilots had left. Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for today's lesson about hesitation. I've been struggling with that issue for months, but no one else had been able to explain it the way you did. I think I understand now what you meant about flying with purpose rather than just flying with skill. As evening fell over Peterson Air Force Base, Sarah walked among the parked F-22 Raptors, their sleek forms silhouetted against the Colorado sky. Each aircraft represented millions of dollars of advanced technology and years of development, but their true value lay in the pilots who would take them into harm's way to protect American interests around the world. Her job was to ensure that those pilots were prepared for whatever challenges they might face. The weight of responsibility felt familiar and welcome. Training pilots wasn't just about teaching them to fly better. It was about preparing them to make life and death decisions under extreme pressure, while carrying out missions that could affect the balance of power in regions thousands of miles away. Sarah had done this work before, but now she was doing it with the wisdom that came from having actually flown those missions and returned to tell about them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new lessons, but tonight she felt satisfied with the progress made. 12 young pilots had taken their first steps toward becoming the kind of aviators who could handle any situation with confidence and skill. It was a good beginning, but Sarah knew that the real test would come in the weeks ahead as the training intensified and the scenarios became more complex and demanding. 3 weeks into the intensive training program, Sarah received an encrypted message that changed everything. The communication came through official military channels, marked with the highest security classifications. As she decoded the message in the secure communications facility, she realized that her return to active involvement in military aviation was about to take on dimensions she hadn't anticipated. The message was brief, but loaded with implications. Colonel Mitchell, your presence is requested at Nellis Air Force Base for Operation Thunderstrike evaluation. Your experience with classified deep penetration missions makes you essential personnel for this assessment. Departure 0600 tomorrow. Classification level remains compartmented. Sarah stared at the screen, memories flooding back of missions she had thought were permanently buried in classified files. Operation Thunderstrike was the code name for a joint training exercise that would test America's most advanced air combat capabilities against simulated, near-peer adversaries. The scenario involved penetrating heavily defended airspace using a combination of stealth technology, electronic warfare, and tactical innovation. It was exactly the type of mission Sarah had flown during her most classified assignments, when success depended not just on superior technology, but on the pilot's ability to think several moves ahead of the enemy. At Nellis, Sarah found herself in a briefing room filled with the Air Force's most senior pilots and tactical planners. The operation would involve F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightning IIs, and B-2 Spirit stealth bombers working in coordination against an aggressor force equipped with the latest foreign fighter aircraft and surface-to-air missile systems. The complexity of the mission was unlike anything attempted in peacetime training exercises. General Patricia Wells, the exercise commander, welcomed Sarah with the kind of recognition reserved for pilots who had proven themselves in actual combat. "Colonel Mitchell, your mission reports from classified operations have become required reading for our advanced tactical planners. We need your expertise in evaluating whether our current pilots can handle the kind of deep strike missions that may be required in future conflicts." The briefing revealed the scope of the challenge. Intelligence suggested that potential adversaries had developed new radar technologies and fighter tactics specifically designed to counter American stealth advantages. The exercise would test whether U.S. pilots could adapt their strategies and maintain air superiority when facing opponents who understood their capabilities and had prepared countermeasures. Accordingly, Sarah's role would be unique. She would fly as an observer in a specially configured F-22, monitoring pilot performance and tactical decision-making during the most challenging phases of the mission. Her job was to assess whether the training programs were adequately preparing pilots for combat scenarios that pushed both human and machine capabilities to their absolute limits. The night before the exercise, Sarah found herself in the pilot's lounge at Nellis, surrounded by some of the most skilled aviators in the world. The conversation was different from what she had experienced at Peterson. These were not student pilots learning basic skills, but experienced combat veterans who understood the stakes involved in air-to-air combat. Their discussions revealed a level of tactical sophistication that impressed even Sarah's experienced perspective. Colonel Marcus Thompson, the mission commander, had flown combat missions in multiple theaters and possessed the kind of instinctive understanding of air warfare that couldn't be taught in classrooms. "The intelligence briefings suggest our adversaries have been studying our tactics for years," he told Sarah. "They know how we fight, they know our capabilities, and they've designed their defenses accordingly. This exercise will show us whether we can still maintain our edge when surprise is no longer on our side." The pre-dawn briefing was conducted with the seriousness of an actual combat mission. Weather conditions, threat assessments, communication protocols, and contingency plans were discussed in meticulous detail. Sarah noticed that the pilots approached the exercise with the same level of preparation and focus they would bring to a real war scenario. This wasn't training for training's sake. It was preparation for potential conflicts that could determine the future balance of global power. The F-22 Raptor that Sarah would fly in had been modified with additional sensors and recording equipment to capture every aspect of the mission. Her pilot, Captain David Chen, was a seasoned F-22 instructor with combat experience in both air-to-air and air-to-ground missions. "Ma'am, it's an honor to fly with you," he said as they conducted their pre-flight inspection. "I've studied your classified mission reports. Your penetration of defended airspace during Operation Silent Thunder is still considered the gold standard for deep strike missions." As they taxied toward the runway, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and focus that preceded challenging flights. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, its stark beauty providing a dramatic backdrop for what was about to unfold. Radio chatter filled their headsets as the various aircraft in the strike package coordinated their movements and verified their communication systems. The takeoff was smooth, and within minutes they were climbing toward their assigned altitude. The F-22's powerful engines pushed them effortlessly through the thin air as they joined the formation of aircraft that would attempt to penetrate the simulated enemy defenses. Sarah monitored the tactical displays, watching as the complex dance of modern air warfare began to unfold around them. The first phase of the mission involved evading long-range surface-to-air missiles while maintaining formation integrity. Sarah watched as the pilots executed evasive maneuvers with precision, their aircraft disappearing and reappearing on radar screens as they used terrain features and electronic countermeasures to avoid detection. The level of coordination required was extraordinary, with each pilot having to maintain awareness of multiple threats while staying in position relative to their wingman. Contact. Bearing 270 60 miles, came the calm voice of the AWACS controller. Enemy fighters had been detected, and the formation would have to fight its way through the defensive screen while maintaining enough fuel and weapons to complete their primary mission. Sarah observed as the tactical picture became increasingly complex, with multiple groups of aircraft maneuvering for advantage in three-dimensional space. The engagement that followed demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of current training programs. The American pilots executed their attack patterns flawlessly, using superior technology and training to gain initial advantages over their adversaries. However, Sarah noticed several instances where pilots hesitated when faced with tactical situations that hadn't been covered in their standard training scenarios. During one particularly intense engagement, Captain Rodriguez from Peterson appeared on Sarah's tactical display, flying as wingman to an experienced flight leader. Sarah watched as Rodriguez successfully engaged two enemy fighters, demonstrating the confidence and decisiveness that had been lacking during her earlier training. The lessons learned at Peterson were clearly paying dividends in this more realistic combat environment. The mission's climax came when the strike package encountered a sophisticated air defense network that used multiple radar, frequencies, and coordinated missile engagements to challenge the American stealth advantage. Several aircraft were forced to abort their attack runs, while others pressed forward despite heavy defensive fire. Sarah found herself evaluating split-second decisions that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. As the exercise concluded and the various aircraft returned to Nellis, Sarah began formulating her assessment of what she had observed. The pilots had demonstrated exceptional technical skills and tactical knowledge, but there were gaps in their preparation for truly challenging scenarios. The enemy had adapted faster than anticipated, requiring American pilots to think beyond their established procedures and doctrine. The post-mission debrief lasted for hours, with every aspect of the exercise analyzed in detail. Sarah's observations would become part of a classified report that would influence pilot training programs for years to come. The exercise had revealed both strengths and weaknesses in current capabilities, providing valuable insights for future tactical development. That evening, as Sarah prepared her preliminary findings, she reflected on how much military aviation had evolved since her early days as a pilot. The technology was more advanced, the scenarios more complex, and the potential consequences more significant than ever before. Yet the fundamental requirements remained the same. Pilots who could think clearly under pressure, make sound decisions with incomplete information, and execute missions that pushed both human and machine capabilities to their limits. Her phone buzzed with a message from Captain Rodriguez. "Ma'am, thank you for the training at Peterson. Today I finally understood what you meant about flying with purpose. I couldn't have engaged those targets effectively without the confidence your instruction gave me." Sarah smiled, knowing that the real measure of her success wouldn't be found in official reports, but in the increased capability and confidence of the pilots she had helped to train. 6 months after Operation Thunderstrike, Sarah found herself standing in the Pentagon briefing room where her classified career had begun over 2 decades earlier. The familiar weight of her dress uniform felt strange after months of flight suits and civilian clothes, but the occasion demanded the formality that her rank and experience commanded. Around the conference table sat some of the most senior leadership in American military aviation, and their attention was focused entirely on her comprehensive assessment of pilot training and combat readiness. General Patricia Wells opened the briefing with words that carried the weight of national security implications. Colonel Mitchell's evaluation of current pilot capabilities has identified critical gaps in our training programs that could affect our ability to maintain air superiority in future conflicts. Her recommendations have the potential to fundamentally change how we prepare our pilots for combat. Sarah felt the familiar pressure of responsibility that came with being asked to influence decisions that would affect thousands of pilots and potentially determine the outcome of future conflicts. The presentation began with video, footage from Operation Thunderstrike, showing both the successes and failures that Sarah had observed during the exercise. The assembled generals and admirals watched intently as F-22 pilots demonstrated exceptional technical skills but struggled when faced with tactical situations that required creative problem-solving rather than adherence to established procedures. The implications were clear. American pilots were being trained to fight the last war, not the next one. Our current training programs produce technically proficient pilots who excel in structured scenarios, Sarah explained. But they struggle when adversaries adapt faster than our doctrine anticipates. During Thunderstrike, we saw multiple instances where enemy tactics succeeded because our pilots hesitated when confronted with situations that weren't covered in their training manuals. The room remained silent as the leadership absorbed the significance of her assessment. The heart of Sarah's presentation focused on the need for what she termed adaptive thinking training. Traditional flight training emphasized standardized responses to known threats, but future conflicts would likely involve adversaries who had studied American tactics and developed countermeasures. Pilots would need to think beyond their training and develop solutions to problems they had never encountered before. During my classified missions, Sarah continued, success often depended on making decisions that contradicted established doctrine because the enemy had anticipated our standard responses. We need to train pilots to think like chess masters, always considering several moves, ahead and preparing for multiple contingencies simultaneously. The concept challenged fundamental assumptions about military training that emphasized consistency and predictability. Admiral James Morrison, the Joint Chiefs representative, raised a concern that Sarah had anticipated. Colonel Mitchell, how do we balance the need for creative thinking with the discipline and standardization that makes our military effective? We can't have pilots improvising in situations that require coordinated responses. It was a valid point that struck at the heart of military culture and the tension between individual initiative and organizational effectiveness. Sarah's response drew on her combat experience and recent observations at Peterson and Nellis. Admiral, the key is teaching pilots when to follow procedures and when to adapt beyond them. During my most challenging missions, I followed standard protocols until the situation demanded innovation. The pilots who survive and succeed in combat are those who can recognize when circumstances require thinking outside established parameters. The briefing continued with specific recommendations for enhancing pilot training programs. Sarah proposed incorporating more unpredictable scenarios, reducing reliance on simulation in favor of real flight training, and establishing mentorship programs that paired experienced combat pilots with newer aviators. Each recommendation was supported by data from her observations and analysis of current training outcomes. The discussion that followed revealed the complexity of implementing changes in military aviation training. Budget constraints, safety concerns, and institutional resistance to change all presented significant obstacles to reform. However, the exercise results had demonstrated clearly that maintaining the status quo could leave American pilots unprepared for future conflicts against increasingly sophisticated adversaries. General Robert Hayes, the Air Force Chief of Staff, posed a question that cut to the core of Sarah's recommendations. Colonel Mitchell, your proposals would require significant changes to training programs that have produced successful pilots for decades. How do we know that increasing emphasis on adaptive thinking won't compromise the fundamental skills that make our pilots effective in the first place? Sarah had wrestled with this question throughout her analysis, knowing that her recommendations challenged established training methodologies. General, during Operation Thunderstrike, I observed pilots who possessed exceptional technical skills but couldn't apply them effectively when faced with unexpected situations. The fundamental skills remain essential, but they must be built upon a foundation of adaptive thinking rather than rigid adherence to procedures. The presentation moved to specific case studies from the exercise, including Captain Rodriguez's successful engagement of enemy fighters and Lieutenant Morrison's initial struggles with degraded instrument flying. Sarah used these examples to illustrate how pilots who had received adaptive thinking training performed significantly better under pressure than those who relied solely on procedural knowledge. The difference wasn't in their technical abilities, Sarah explained, but in their confidence to trust their judgment when circumstances demanded deviation from standard operating procedures. Rodriguez had learned to recognize when her training was insufficient for the situation at hand and to develop solutions based on fundamental principles rather than memorized responses. The briefing room's atmosphere grew more intense as Sarah presented her most controversial recommendation, the establishment of what she called failure training. This concept involved deliberately placing pilots in scenarios where their standard responses would be inadequate, forcing them to develop creative solutions or accept mission failure. The idea challenged military culture's emphasis on success and could potentially damage pilot confidence if implemented incorrectly. Failure training isn't about teaching pilots to fail, Sarah clarified, sensing the resistance in the room. It's about teaching them to recover from failure and to learn from situations where their initial approach proves inadequate. Every combat pilot will eventually face a situation where their training isn't sufficient. The question is whether they've learned to adapt or whether they'll freeze when confronted with the unexpected. The discussion that followed revealed deep divisions within the military leadership about the appropriate balance between standardization and innovation in pilot training. Some officers argued that successful military operations depended on predictable responses and coordinated actions, while others recognized the need for pilots who could think independently when circumstances demanded it. Captain Chen, who had served as Sarah's pilot during the Thunderstrike evaluation, was called upon to provide his perspective on the proposed changes. "Ma'am, gentlemen, flying with Colonel Mitchell during the exercise was unlike anything I had experienced in 15 years of military aviation. She consistently anticipated tactical developments that our standard training hadn't prepared us for, and her ability to adapt to changing conditions was extraordinary. If we can teach even a fraction of that capability to our pilots, it would represent a significant improvement in combat readiness." The meeting concluded with a decision to implement a pilot program based on Sarah's recommendations. 3 training squadrons would serve as test units for the new methodologies, with their performance compared to control groups using traditional training methods. Sarah would oversee the implementation and assess the results over a 12-month period. As the generals and admirals filed out of the briefing room, General Wells approached Sarah with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Colonel, what you're proposing represents the most significant change to pilot training in decades. The success or failure of this program could affect the careers of everyone in this room, not to mention the combat readiness of the entire Air Force. Are you confident that these changes will produce better pilots?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "General, I'm confident that these changes will produce pilots who are better prepared for the uncertainties of modern combat. Whether that makes them better pilots depends on how we define success. If we measure success by adherence to procedures, then traditional training methods are adequate. If we measure success by mission accomplishment under challenging conditions, then we need pilots who can think beyond their training." The weeks following the Pentagon briefing were filled with intensive planning sessions as Sarah worked with training command personnel to develop curricula for the pilot program. The challenge was maintaining the technical proficiency that made American pilots effective, while introducing the flexibility and creative thinking that would be essential for future conflicts. Sarah found herself drawing on experiences from throughout her career, from her early days as a student pilot struggling to master basic flying skills to her classified missions, where success depended on split-second decisions made with incomplete information. Each memory contributed to her understanding of how to balance structure with innovation in pilot training. The 1st Test Squadron began the new training program at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas. Sarah observed the initial sessions with interest, watching as pilots who had excelled under traditional training methods struggled to adapt to scenarios that had no predetermined solutions. The learning curve was steep, and some pilots initially resisted the ambiguity that characterized the new approach. However, as the weeks progressed, Sarah began to see encouraging signs of development. Pilots who had initially been frustrated by the lack of clear procedures began to demonstrate increased confidence in their decision-making abilities. They started to view uncertain situations as challenges to be solved rather than problems to be avoided. Captain Rodriguez, who had been selected as one of the test pilots, provided regular feedback on the program's effectiveness. Ma'am, at first I hated the uncertainty of not knowing what the right answer was supposed to be. But now I realize that in real combat, there often isn't a right answer, just better and worse decisions based on the information available. Learning to trust my judgment has made me a more effective pilot and a more confident person. The program's success wasn't universal, however. Some pilots struggled to adapt to the increased ambiguity and responsibility that came with adaptive thinking training. A few requested transfers to units using traditional training methods, preferring the clarity of predetermined responses to the uncertainty of creative problem-solving. Sarah viewed these departures not as failures, but as important data points about the type of pilot best suited for future combat scenarios. As the first phase of the pilot program neared completion, Sarah prepared for the comprehensive evaluation that would determine whether her recommendations would be implemented throughout the Air Force. The stakes were enormous, both for her personally and for the thousands of pilots whose careers would be affected by the decision. 1 year after the Pentagon briefing, Sarah stood on the flight line at Edwards Air Force Base, watching as F-22 Raptors from her pilot training program prepared for the most comprehensive evaluation in modern military aviation history. Operation Final Thunder would test whether her revolutionary training methods had produced pilots capable of handling the most challenging combat scenarios imaginable. The exercise would involve not just American forces, but Allied pilots from Britain, Australia, and Japan, creating a truly international assessment of adaptive pilot training. The morning briefing brought together over 200 pilots, representing both traditional training programs and Sarah's experimental squadrons. The contrast between the two groups was immediately apparent to experienced observers. Traditional pilots sat in neat rows, notebooks ready, waiting for detailed instructions about their missions. The adaptive training graduates displayed more relaxed postures, engaging in quiet discussions about potential scenarios and creative solutions to anticipated challenges. General Patricia Wells, now the Air Force Chief of Staff, opened the briefing with words that acknowledged the historical significance of the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, the results of this exercise will determine the future of American pilot training for the next generation. We're not just evaluating new training methods. We're assessing our ability to maintain air superiority in an increasingly complex and unpredictable world. The exercise scenario was based on intelligence assessments of potential near-peer conflicts, involving sophisticated enemy air defenses, advanced fighter aircraft, and electronic warfare capabilities that could neutralize traditional American advantages. Unlike previous exercises, the opposition forces would adapt their tactics in real time, forcing pilots to continuously adjust their approaches throughout the mission. Sarah's role had evolved from observer to senior advisor, but she had requested permission to fly one final combat mission as an evaluation pilot. At 51 years old, she was technically beyond the age limit for combat flying, but her unique experience and intimate knowledge of the training program made her participation essential. The F-22 Raptor assigned to her had been specially configured with advanced recording equipment to capture every aspect of pilot decision-making during the most challenging phases of the exercise. Captain Rodriguez, now a major after her exceptional performance during the pilot program, would serve as Sarah's wingman for the mission. Their partnership represented the culmination of the mentorship relationship that had begun at Peterson Air Force Base 18 months earlier. "Ma'am, it's an honor to fly with you on this mission," Rodriguez said during their pre-flight briefing. "Everything I've learned about adaptive flying came from your instruction." The mission profile was deliberately designed to challenge every aspect of pilot training. The strike package would have to penetrate layered defenses, engage multiple threats simultaneously, and adapt to changing tactical situations while maintaining formation integrity and mission focus. Intelligence briefings suggested that the enemy had studied American tactics extensively and prepared countermeasures for every standard approach. As Sarah strapped into her aircraft, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From her early days as one of the first female F-22 pilots to her classified combat missions, and eventually to her role in revolutionizing pilot training, every experience had contributed to this final evaluation of her life's work. The success or failure of the exercise would determine whether her vision of adaptive pilot training would become the new standard or be relegated to experimental status. The takeoff sequence proceeded flawlessly, with 48 F-22 Raptors launching in coordinated waves toward their assigned patrol areas. Sarah monitored the tactical displays as the complex choreography of modern air warfare began to unfold. Radio communications were deliberately kept to a minimum to avoid enemy interception, requiring pilots to rely on their training and instincts, rather than detailed instructions from command and control aircraft. The first indication that this exercise would be different came when the enemy air defense network began, operating on frequencies that hadn't appeared in intelligence briefings. Traditional pilots following standard procedures found their electronic countermeasures ineffective, while adaptive training graduates immediately began experimenting with alternative approaches. Sarah watched as the tactical picture became increasingly chaotic, with some aircraft successfully penetrating the defenses while others were forced to abort their missions. Major Rodriguez demonstrated the effectiveness of adaptive training when her flight encountered a new type of surface-to-air missile that used unconventional guidance systems. Instead of following established evasion procedures that proved ineffective, she developed an improvised countermeasure based on her understanding of radar physics and missile flight dynamics. Her creative solution not only saved her flight but provided a tactical innovation that was quickly adopted by other pilots in the exercise. The air-to-air combat phase of the exercise proved to be the most challenging test of pilot adaptability. Enemy fighters using advanced electronic warfare systems managed to disrupt the data links that American pilots typically relied on for situational awareness. Pilots from traditional training programs struggled without their usual information sources, while adaptive training graduates fell back on visual flying skills and tactical instincts that enabled them to maintain combat effectiveness. Sarah found herself engaged in a complex dogfight with multiple enemy aircraft, her decades of experience and recent training insights combining to create tactical opportunities that younger pilots might have missed. The engagement demonstrated that adaptive thinking wasn't just for young pilots. Experienced aviators could benefit from the enhanced decision-making capabilities that the new training methods provided. The climax of the exercise came when a simulated cruise missile strike eliminated the primary command and control center, leaving individual flight leaders to continue the mission without centralized coordination. This scenario tested the ultimate goal of adaptive pilot training, the ability to accomplish mission objectives when all standard procedures and support systems had failed. Traditional pilots, accustomed to detailed mission briefings and constant communication with command elements, struggled to maintain effectiveness without external guidance. However, pilots from Sarah's program demonstrated remarkable adaptability, forming impromptu tactical formations and developing creative solutions to complete their assigned objectives despite the breakdown in command structure. The exercise concluded and aircraft began returning to Edwards Air Force Base. The initial assessments were overwhelmingly positive for the adaptive training program. Pilots trained under Sarah's methods had achieved mission success rates nearly 30% higher than their traditionally trained counterparts, and they had demonstrated significantly better performance in scenarios requiring creative problem-solving. The post-mission debriefing lasted for 2 days, with every aspect of pilot performance analyzed in exhaustive detail. Sarah's final presentation to the evaluation board summarized the results with quiet satisfaction. The data clearly demonstrates that pilots trained in adaptive thinking methods are better prepared for the unpredictable nature of modern combat. They maintain effectiveness when standard procedures prove inadequate, and they demonstrate superior judgment when faced with novel tactical situations. General Wells announced the board's decision 3 days later, in a ceremony attended by senior military leadership from multiple allied nations. Based on the comprehensive evaluation conducted during Operation Final Thunder, the United States Air Force will implement adaptive pilot training methods across all fighter pilot training programs. Colonel Sarah Mitchell's vision has proven itself under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The announcement represented the culmination of Sarah's decades-long career in military aviation, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter. As the ceremony concluded, she was approached by representatives from allied air forces interested in implementing similar training programs in their own countries. Her influence on military aviation would extend far beyond American borders. 6 months later, Sarah found herself once again boarding a commercial airliner, this time traveling to NATO headquarters in Brussels to consult on international pilot training standards. As she settled into her seat, she noticed a young Air Force captain in uniform sitting across the aisle, studying technical manuals with the intense focus that characterized serious military aviators. The captain looked up and recognition dawned on his face. "Colonel Mitchell? Ma'am, I'm Captain James Park from the 94th Fighter Squadron. I graduated from the new adaptive training program last month." Sarah smiled, remembering the mixture of excitement and nervousness that characterized newly qualified fighter pilots. "How are you finding the transition to operational flying?" she asked. "Ma'am, the adaptive training made all the difference during my first combat deployment. We encountered tactical situations that weren't covered in any manual, but the training had prepared me to think through problems and develop solutions based on fundamental principles. I felt confident even when facing the unexpected." Park's answer